The soft music that had been floating through the wedding hall suddenly faltered when the bride, flawless in her pearl-embroidered gown, turned sharply to face me, her eyes, blazing under the golden lights above, cut through the air with an accusation that silenced every whispered conversation. "You ruined my dress," she snapped, pointing at a faint champagne stain along the hem, something I hadn't even noticed happen. The chatter dissolved into a heavy, watchful hush. I sat quietly in the far corner, my hands folded in my lap, but now every pair of eyes in the room felt like a spotlight burning into my skin. The bridesmaids stepped back slightly, their pastel skirts swaying as though they wanted no part in what was about to unfold. My first instinct was to stand and explain, to tell her the truth, that I hadn't been anywhere near her in the last 10 minutes, but my legs refused to move. Any word I spoke now would sound like a flimsy defense against her public humiliation. From the altar, the CEO turned his head, his gaze locking on me. His eyes narrowed, but not in anger. No, there was something sharper there, something unreadable that made my pulse race. I could feel the tension knotting the air between us, see the way his jaw tightened, and in that frozen moment, with the entire room holding its breath, I realized this wasn't some impulsive outburst from a nervous bride. No, this was calculated, meant to corner me in front of everyone. I just didn't know yet whether she was playing for embarrassment or for destruction. But I could sense, deep down, that the next words spoken would change everything. The bride took a deliberate step toward me, her heels clicking like a metronome of judgment across the marble floor. The delicate scent of her perfume, sweet yet suffocating, filled the air between us. I could feel the warmth of dozens of stares pressing against my skin, waiting to see if I'd crumble. Her voice rose again, higher and sharper this time. "Do you know how much this dress cost? Do you know what you've done?" she demanded, as if the fabric's price tag was the true measure of a person's worth. My throat tightened, but I stayed silent. Around us, the string quartet's bows hovered awkwardly over their instruments, suspended mid-note. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with unease. I searched the crowd for an ally, but all I found were eyes darting away, afraid to be caught in the middle. From the altar, he still hadn't moved, still watching me like he was weighing every possibility, every truth. And then I saw it, the tiniest flicker of a smirk on the bride's lips, the satisfaction of someone who believed she had just turned the tide in her favor. That's when my pulse slowed. This wasn't about a stain, it never had been. This was about making me small, disposable, a shadow she could brush out of the picture before she said, "I do." I inhaled slowly, keeping my hand steady in my lap. Whatever game she thought she was playing, she had underestimated one thing. The man at the altar wasn't a pawn in her plan, and neither was I. He stepped down from the altar without breaking eye contact with me, the murmur of the guests swelling like a wave about to crash. The bride's triumphant posture faltered, her shoulders stiffening as his shadow grew closer. His polished shoes clicked against the floor until he stopped between us, the space suddenly charged with something no one dared interrupt. "Is this true?" he asked her, his tone low, but carrying across the entire hall. She hesitated, eyes darting to the crowd, searching for someone to back her claim. "She ruined my dress," she repeated. But this time her voice lacked the conviction it had moments ago. His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, I thought he might still defend her. Instead, he turned his gaze to the security team standing near the doors. "If that's how you see it," he said slowly, "then we're not getting married." The words landed like a bell toll, echoing in stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the guests, and the bride's face drained of color. "Security," he commanded, his voice steel, "take her out now." The guards hesitated only for a second before moving forward, their black suits slicing through the crowd. As they approached, I realized the weight of what had just happened. In one breath, he had dismantled her world and shifted mine forever. The bride stumbled backward, sputtering protests, but his hand was already reaching for mine, not in pity, but in a quiet, deliberate choice that everyone in that room would remember. The whispers followed me like shadows as I stood in the corner of the lavish reception hall. Every crystal chandelier sparkled. Every guest shimmered in designer gowns and tailored suits. Yet I felt like the only imperfection in the room. My plain, pastel dress suddenly felt like a stain against the sea of luxury. I clutched my small clutch tighter, trying to steady my breathing, but then she appeared, his fiancée, in a storm of ivory silk and sparkling jewels. Her eyes locked on me with a venom so sharp, I could almost feel it pierce my skin. "You've ruined my dress," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. Gasps echoed as she stepped closer, pointing an accusing finger at the faint, barely there smudge on the hem of her gown. I tried to speak, to explain that I had been nowhere near her until now, but my words tangled in my throat. Guests began to murmur, glances darting between us, their judgment already written across their faces. My cheeks burned, not just from the accusation, but from the humiliation of knowing everyone thought I had come here to cause trouble. In that moment, the music seemed to fade, the clinking glasses went silent, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I felt small, outnumbered, cornered, and yet, somewhere deep down, a strange calm began to form. Because I could sense it, this wasn't over. Someone else in this room knew the truth, and they weren't going to let me drown alone. Before I could gather my thoughts, she stepped even closer, her perfume heavy in the air, her voice dripping with false sweetness for the audience, now watching us like a live drama. "Some people just can't stand to see others happy," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. The crowd's expressions hardened, some out of loyalty to her, others simply enjoying the spectacle. My pulse raced, and my fingers tightened around the clutch until my knuckles turned white. I could feel the sting of tears threatening to rise, but I forced them back. This was her game, and I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of watching me break. I noticed the way she kept glancing toward the head table, where he, her soon-to-be husband and the CEO, was seated, deep in conversation. She wanted him to look up and see me as the villain. And just as she opened her mouth again, probably to deliver the final blow, a sudden shift in the room's energy caught me off guard. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs scraped softly as people turned. My eyes followed theirs, and there he was, walking toward us with steady, deliberate steps, his gaze locked not on her, but on me. For a brief second, I couldn't read his expression. It was calm, yet there was something dangerous simmering beneath it. He stopped beside her, his presence towering, his voice low but clear enough for every guest to hear. "Repeat that," he said, his tone like steel. She blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting him to intervene this way. And in that breathless pause, I realized something. The truth was about to come crashing into this perfect, glittering wedding like a storm no one saw coming. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The confidence she had worn like a crown only moments ago seemed to slip, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The guests leaned in, eager for the next move, their curiosity sharp in the charged silence. He turned to face me fully now, his eyes searching mine, not with suspicion, but with something closer to concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer than I expected, yet carrying enough weight to silence the murmurs. I hesitated, aware that anything I said would either ignite a scandal or let her rewrite the story in her favor. My heart pounded, but I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze. "She thinks I ruined her dress," I said, my tone even, refusing to lace it with the outrage clawing at my chest. His brows furrowed, his attention flicking briefly to the immaculate fabric she had been clutching dramatically. The so-called stain was barely visible, a faint smudge that could have been caused by brushing past a table. His jaw tightened as realization dawned. Without breaking eye contact with her, he reached for my hand, not hurriedly but with deliberate care, and pulled me a step closer. "If this is how you treat her," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear, "then maybe there shouldn't be a wedding." Gasps rippled through the hall. Her face paled, the color draining as though someone had pulled the ground from beneath her feet. My breath caught, not because of the chaos his words unleashed, but because for the first time that evening I felt like someone had chosen to stand between me and the storm. The room erupted into a tangled web of whispers, like 1,000 tiny threads pulling in different directions. Cameras from guests' phones lit up in every corner, capturing the moment before it could vanish. Her fingers, still gripping the folds of her gown, trembled, not with fear, but with rage barely contained. She stepped toward him, her voice dropping into a hiss meant only for his ears, though everyone could feel the venom in her tone. "You're humiliating me," she said. He didn't flinch. If anything, his grip on my hand tightened, an anchor keeping me steady while the entire room felt like it might turn on me. My mind raced back to the countless times I had been the easy target, the woman whose presence could be explained away with a careless insult, whose defense wasn't worth the trouble. But this time the air felt different. I could feel every pair of eyes shifting, some skeptical, others intrigued, a few perhaps seeing me for the first time as something more than a convenient scapegoat. He guided me a step forward, his posture commanding enough to redirect the energy of the crowd. "No one humiliates her here," he said, his voice low but unyielding. A hush fell again, heavier this time, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She opened her mouth to respond, but her father's hand on her arm stopped her, the unspoken message clear. The battle had shifted, and she had already lost the first round. My pulse roared in my ears, but for the first time that night, it wasn't from fear. It was from the shocking possibility that I was no longer standing alone. He led me toward an empty table near the front, his hand still resting lightly over mine, as though to remind me that leaving wasn't an option, that I belonged here as much as anyone. The soft hum of music resumed, though it felt almost fragile, like a thin veil over the tension still clinging to the air. I could sense the guests watching us, their conversations returning in cautious fragments, the scandal still fresh enough to taste. She stood across the room, her white gown pristine again after the flurry of attendants wiped away the last trace of red wine, but her glare cut through the distance. I felt the old instinct rising, that urge to shrink, to disappear before the whispers became daggers. Yet when I shifted my gaze to him, the way he sat beside me, calm, shoulders squared, completely unbothered by the glares, anchored me in place. "You've done nothing wrong," he murmured, his voice a quiet contrast to the noise around us. For a moment, I believed him. The servers hesitated, unsure if they should still bring out the next course, but he waved them on, almost defiantly, as if to declare that the night would continue on his terms. Every detail, the flicker of candlelight, the muted clink of cutlery, the faint scent of roses drifting from the centerpieces, felt sharper now, etched into memory. The weight of humiliation I'd expected to carry for days was lighter, replaced by something I couldn't name yet. I didn't know if this was protection, defiance, or something more complicated, but I knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one being asked to leave. When the music shifted to something slower, a murmur ran through the room. Part surprise, part curiosity. Without asking, he stood and extended his hand toward me. My first instinct was to shake my head, to avoid drawing more attention, but his eyes held a quiet insistence that made refusal impossible. My fingers slid into his, and the warmth of his palm pulled me to my feet. The space cleared instinctively, guests stepping back as if making way for something they didn't quite understand yet. The chandeliers above bathed the floor in golden light, and for a moment it was just the two of us. His arms settled around my waist, steady and unyielding, while his other hand guided mine to his shoulder. We moved, not perfectly, but in sync enough to feel like the room had been built for this single moment. I was acutely aware of the fiancée's rigid posture at her table, the forced smile that cracked under the strain of every step we took. I could almost hear the unspoken questions swirling among the guests. Who is she? Why is he with her? But in his presence, the sting of speculation dulled. "You're stronger than you think," he whispered, so low only I could hear. My chest tightened, not from embarrassment, but from an unfamiliar kind of relief. For the first time that evening, I wasn't bracing for another blow. Instead, I let myself breathe, fully, freely, while the room that had once felt like a trial now felt like a stage where my worth was no longer up for debate. The guests were silent, frozen between disbelief and curiosity, as the string quartet faltered mid-note. I could feel every stare on my back, each one heavier than the last. My hands trembled slightly, still damp from the water they'd used to try and wash the champagne off my dress. I hadn't moved from the spot where he'd stopped me, my breath uneven, my mind replaying his words over and over. Then we're not getting married. His voice hadn't been raised, but the weight of it had been louder than any shout. His fiancée's face had turned pale, her painted lips parting in shock before she tried to laugh it off, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. But he didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on me, steady, unwavering, as if trying to make sure I understood that this was no impulsive act. A murmur rose among the guests, whispers darting from one table to another, the kind that travel faster than truth. I wanted to disappear, to vanish before anyone could read the confusion on my face. Yet, at the same time, a strange warmth bloomed in my chest, an unfamiliar sense of being defended, of someone drawing a line in the sand for me. It wasn't love, I told myself it couldn't be, but the way he stood there, tuxedo perfectly pressed, eyes locking with mine like there was no one else in the room, made me question that certainty. The wedding, the flowers, the music, all of it suddenly felt like a set built for a scene neither of us had planned, but one we were already living. He took a step toward me, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, the sound oddly loud in the hushed tension. The bride, no, his former bride, grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his sleeve. But he didn't flinch. "You think I didn't notice?" he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "From the very start, you've been trying to tear her down." Her eyes widened, and she glanced at the guests, as if searching for someone to side with her, but the silence that met her plea was damning. He gently shook her hand off and turned back to me. "You don't deserve this," he added, the softness in his voice a sharp contrast to the cold finality in his eyes when he'd spoken to her. My heart thudded unevenly, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified of what his words meant. Around us, the tension thickened, the weight of unspoken questions filling the room. Somewhere in the background, the coordinator whispered frantically into a headset, probably trying to figure out how to salvage a wedding that no longer existed. I wanted to tell him to stop, to not ruin everything he had worked for because of me, but my voice refused to obey. He reached out, his hand warm when it brushed my arm, steadying me in a way I didn't realize I needed. The guests were still watching, but now their expressions had shifted from idle curiosity to something closer to awe, like they were witnessing a truth too raw to turn away from. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of a ceremony meant for someone else, I realized this wasn't about a dress or an accusation. It was about choosing a side. He straightened his posture, shoulders squared, as if making a silent promise to the entire room. "This wedding is over," he declared, his voice echoing through the hall like a gavel striking wood. Gasps rippled among the guests, the string quartet falling into an abrupt, awkward silence. The bride's face crumpled, a mix of disbelief and fury flashing in her eyes. She tried to speak, but he raised a hand, stopping her cold. "If you can accuse someone I care about without proof, in front of everyone, then you don't understand what loyalty means." His words cut through the air, sharp and final. My chest tightened, not from shame anymore, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had just dismantled his own future for the sake of my dignity. The coordinator dropped her clipboard. One of the older guests muttered something under their breath, and yet no one dared to step forward. He turned back to me then, his expression softening as if the storm that had raged moments before had passed entirely. "You deserve to be somewhere you're respected," he said, offering his arm. My fingers trembled as they curled around it, the scent of his cologne grounding me in the surrealness of the moment. Together, we walked down the aisle, not as a bride and groom, but as two people leaving behind a room full of whispers. The click of the doors closing behind us felt like the final note in a song I didn't know I'd been waiting to hear. Outside, the air was cooler, freer, and I realized that while he had lost a fiancée, I had gained something far more dangerous, his unwavering allegiance. And maybe the start of something neither of us was ready to name. The days after the wedding felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream where every glance carried a new meaning. The guests whispered behind their hands, the social media posts speculated endlessly, and the company hallways buzzed with rumors about what had happened that night. But amid the noise, something unexpected happened. People started looking at me differently, not with suspicion or disdain, but with a cautious respect that I hadn't seen before. The CEO's support had shifted the narrative, making me no longer the target, but the one who stood beside the man who mattered most. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I found him waiting by the entrance. Without a word, he took my hand and led me to a quiet rooftop garden. The city stretched out below us, lights twinkling like distant stars. "You changed everything," he said softly. "Not just for me, but for everyone who ever felt invisible." I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "I just stood still," I replied. "You stood up," he corrected, smiling gently. We stood there in silence, the weight of that moment settling between us. It wasn't a confession or a promise, just a quiet understanding that our lives had been altered forever. And as the cool breeze brushed past us, I realized that the wedding hadn't been the end of a story. It had been the beginning of something far more powerful, a partnership built on respect, strength, and an unspoken vow to face whatever came next together. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to test that unspoken bond. Invitations to high-profile events arrived with my name printed alongside his, as if the industry had suddenly decided I belonged in their inner circle. Yet, I noticed the subtle glances from those who still doubted me. Tiny smirks, lingering stares, the occasional accidental brush of a shoulder meant to remind me of my place. He noticed them too. At one charity gala, as I hesitated near the edge of the red carpet, feeling the weight of every camera, he leaned in and whispered, "Walk like you own it, because you do." The words steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. Each step beside him a quiet declaration that I would no longer shrink under scrutiny. Inside, as champagne glasses clinked and polite laughter filled the air, he never once let go of my hand. Every introduction was deliberate. "This is the woman I trust more than anyone." Those words, repeated to executives, investors, and even journalists, built a new shield around me. One crafted not of defense, but of undeniable truth. Still, when I was alone at night, I'd replay the accusations from the wedding, wondering if shadows of that moment would ever fully disappear. But then I'd remember the way he had stood there unshaken, and how his voice had cut through the chaos with certainty. And I realized that even if the whispers never stopped, they could never erase the fact that he had chosen to stand with me, publicly, unapologetically, and without hesitation. That choice, I knew, would define more than just our reputations. It would define our future. The final confirmation came on a quiet evening, far from the noise of galas and boardrooms. We were in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath us like a galaxy at our feet. He set down 2 mugs of tea on the table, then returned with a small velvet box in his hand. Not the kind for jewelry, but for something more permanent. Inside was a set of keys. "Not to the penthouse," he said, "but to the new building. Your name is on every document." My breath caught as I looked at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His answer was simple, but it landed with the weight of a promise, "Because I want you to always have a place that no one can take from you." In that moment, the memory of his fiancée's accusations, The stares, the whispered doubts, they all felt like shadows dissolving in the light. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about building something that belonged entirely to us. When I finally turned the key over in my palm, it felt like more than metal. It felt like a shield, a vow, a future. Outside, the skyline blinked with 1,000 possibilities, but none seemed brighter than the one sitting across from me. He didn't need to say, "I believe in you," out loud. He had carved it into the foundation of a building with my name on it. And for the first time since the wedding, I realized I wasn't just surviving their judgment, I was living beyond it.